My subject tonight, as listed in the bulletin, really was a defense against a deadline which brought me face to face with the uneasy feeling of not having ready for publication a sermon title. So I did about the only thing I knew to do. I decided that I would list an extension of the idea of my very first sermon from this pulpit. That was on a Wednesday night, a good while ago before some of you arrived, and then, of course, it was some years ago, a long time after some of you had arrived. On that evening, I spoke on the light of the world from the text which is memorable to me, found in John 8, verse 12. I am the light of the world. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. And there is the optimism, the glow which is deposited by Christian faith that there is still light. Even in the midst of a rapidly changing world, when we have already witnessed spectacles beyond the wildest imagination of any person 11 years ago, as I stood for the first time in this pulpit, I would have never dreamed that after 11 years there would be two men circling the globe of this earth every 90 minutes or less, and would continue to do that for 14 days without interruption, if all goes well. But we do recognize that we're living in changed times. We've witnessed in these 11 years a social revolution in this country. Perhaps we have witnessed the demonstration of more change in these 11 years than in any other 11 years in the lifetime of any single person present. And yet, I think there is room for this optimism expressed. There is still light. We must believe this, and we must do more than believe it. We must make it possible for this light to shine as it wants to and seeks to through our lives. But since I put down the subject, a sermon has come for this hour, and I want to get into it. I wish it were possible for me to reminisce, because there is no contemplation or reflection upon these 11 years past that do not fill me with great emotion. For there are people who have been bound to my own life through the ties of tragedy and sadness, which will always be unforgettable. And I never stand here but what I miss them, and reflect upon what their absence means to the family, and especially to the household of faith, which is our church. There have been so many of these tragedies, so many of these hours of sadness. There's been a great deal of bereavement. It would be difficult to talk about this with a great deal of finesse or grace. But there have been also moments of joy, moments of exhilarating triumph and victory. If these 11 years that began when I was a younger man, and who have spanned the maturing years of my life, and now reached into what really is the decrepitude of a preacher, because a preacher 45, has gone past the peak of his usefulness, and he never really quite knows when he approaches it. It is such an instantaneous, brief happening when a preacher's really desirable. Before 40, he's too young, and afterwards he's too old. And I've never known when I was approaching it and when I was passing it. And as I look back on it, I cannot tell you or describe for you, for the life of me, just when it was that I reached that particular mythical point. But many times I admit to myself that I have. But across these years, there have been many questions that have been raised in my mind, and there have been many baffling situations that have provoked me to thought and to prayer and to examination. And in the struggle, I think there have been two things that I have really sought to know. And I'm not so sure that tonight I have found the answer, but I am encouraged to believe that somehow, by the grace of God, in this examination, in this questing spirit, I have taken a step in that direction. And that is, I've asked myself a great many times, what is it that you want most? I think all of us, in a moment of honesty, when there is a candor that opens our souls for us to look in upon ourselves, must realize and admit that he or she wants something from life. So I've asked myself, and these years have forced in upon me this question, and the answering of it has become inescapable for me. What is it you want? And somehow the answer has come back. I would like to be a servant. I would like to be able to perform a service, not only for mankind, but for my Heavenly Father. This has taken shape in my soul more as the years have passed. But also another persistent question has dogged my heels, and that is, what is service? When is one serving? What does one do when he serves? There's a man here tonight who will forgive me if he recognizes himself in this story, but I must tell it. When death came to that house, there had been many weeks in which there was no wife to attend to things. And when I went that day to pray for him, I saw that he didn't need my prayers nearly as much as he needed what I could do with my hands. And one of the most glorious days I've ever spent in Christian ministry was the day that with a mop and a bucket and a rag and a buffer and wax, we cleaned every piece of furniture and cleaned every inch of floor. And that day was a day that I could not afford to do that. For my sermon was not what it ought to be, and it was not where it ought to be. It was up here partially, but not here. And I thought, I must pore over these notes. I must read again and again what I have written. I must explore this more and more to verify and to reaffirm what I've set down. But in a way which I cannot describe to you tonight, these things that I'd put down were reaffirmed. And when I stood to preach the next day, there was a certainty that I could not have had in any other way. I am saying that here is the ideal of service. And he gives the enlarged vision to the picture. It is not only doing for externally, but it is belonging to somebody and sharing oneself at the deepest level of spiritual experience.